Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is Janelle Blue. Janelle is also the president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, which is our sponsoring organization. And our guest today is LaBrenda Garrett-Nelson. LaBrenda is a former tax attorney. She's retired. She is a certified genealogist. She's a certified genealogical lecturer, and she is also on the board of directors for the Board for Certification of Genealogy. And today we're going to be talking about some current events in genealogy, and we want to first off say we're not endorsing any specific test company for having your DNA tested. So, we're going to be talking about some things, and the first thing I think is going to be some of those companies and what they test.
Well, thank you, Chuck. I'll begin, start us off just by reminding folks that though I am on the board for a trustee of the Board for Certification of Genealogists, everything I talk about will be either in the public realm or expressing my personal opinions about this. The other thing I want to emphasize, because it often gets lost in the discussion of genetic genealogy, is that DNA alone never proves anything. You will always need to use it in combination with traditional genealogical work. And with that, I'll just start in on just explaining the basic direct-to-consumer tests that are available from the various companies. Most of the companies, all of the companies will test your autosomal DNA, and those are tests of the first 22 chromosomes, DNA that you can inherit from any number of ancestors. Although you inherit 50% of your DNA from each of your parents, any combination of ancestors may have contributed to that 50%. Most of the companies also, when they test autosomal DNA, will give you the results of your X DNA. And that's one of the 23rd sex-determining chromosomes. And there is a particular inheritance pattern for that kind of DNA, the X DNA, and that's something that we'll touch on a little later because you need to know how X DNA is inherited. Then there is the Y DNA. And right now, I think Family Tree DNA is the only company that offers a Y DNA test. That is the other of the 23rd pair of chromosomes, and it's the DNA that's passed from father to son. So it's looking at your patrilineal line. There is also mitochondrial DNA, which is outside the nucleus of the cell, and it's passed from a mother to all of her children, but only females pass it on. So that's looking at your matrilineal line. And something to keep in mind is that whether you're focusing on Y DNA or mitochondrial DNA, you should always use those tests in combination with a test of autosomal DNA. And then lastly, a lot of people are testing just to get the ethnicity estimates, yes, or the biogeographical origins. Right. And basically that's looking at where were your ancestors before the advent of transatlantic travel. So those are the basic tests that have just grown exponentially over the last few years in particular. I think the first test started being sold around 1999 or so, and I just read some statistics that as of October, 20 million people have taken autosomal tests.
Wow, that's a lot. But there's probably more in one test. Isn't Ancestry the one that has the most?
Yes,
the biggest
Ancestry
base?
has the biggest database. It probably also has the biggest advertising
yes.
budget,
Yes,
but certainly, and because Ancestry has the largest databases, your reference population is how some people refer to it, you are more likely to find matches. I will say, though, that none of the testing companies have a great representation of people outside of Western Europe. But again, because Ancestry has the largest number, you're more likely to find a match there.
And of that, most of the people are here in the U.S. The test
Correct.
takers in
Correct.
Europe are
Now, and that is where my heritage, I think, holds itself out as, and I think it's true, as having a larger population of people living in Europe. 23andMe, which is focused on health issues, did make a concerted effort to increase the number of African descended people in their reference population. A few years back, they gave away thousands of kits to people who had 4 African American grandparents, I think, and just a year or so ago, they were soliciting tests from people who had 4 sub-Saharan African grandparents. So they did make a concerted effort to beef that up. And as you may know, Ancestry recently increased the number of geographic regions and kind of are revamping their ethnicity estimates to be a little more specific.
Yes.
But my understanding is that all of these ethnicity estimates are only accurate, they're estimates, and they're really only accurate on a continental level. That more work is being done, I think, in Western Europe with surname studies to pinpoint the origins based on Y-DNA studies, but really they're looking at things on a continental level. That's what you can probably be confident of when you look at these ethnicity estimates.
And I know with certain things, for example, in Great Britain, they can only tell you at this point British Isles. My neighbors had theirs done, and she was disappointed because she wanted to know the percentage of her Scottish ancestry, and all she got was British and Irish and German. So,
and some people would say that there isn't that much difference in the DNA
That's
of a
right.
German and a Brit. So.
Well, and if you think about it, the Scots and the Irish were they were back and forth all the time, so that gets pretty difficult.
Yeah.
Also, this is sort of getting into the weeds a little bit, but there are people who just hear about this for the first time think that they've gone in and dug up bones somewhere to get this DNA, and that's not really, it's very rare that they would ever find an indigenous group of people that had 10, 20 generations in that one place where they could really use that as a test.
Well, I understand that there is some ongoing work going on to see what you can get from artifacts.
Yes.
And I'm not as familiar with that, and it is ongoing work. But the 20 million testers that I recently read about, that was a reference to people who have tested through one of the direct-to-consumer DNA tests.
Yeah, I know in the forensic medicine portion of medicine, they can do that because I happen to know somebody who's going to school right now and spent a month over in Greece. And that's what they were actually doing. They
we'll
were
talk when we
looking
get
at
to
bones and seeing what they could get as far as DNA.
And clearly, and we'll talk more about this in our second segment, but the law enforcement officials are using more than, they're using DNA gathered at crime scenes, which is different from what we're talking about right now.
And you mentioned health reasons, and I think it's good to clarify that at this point, it's really only 23andMe that does the health segment, and you have to purposely sign up for that.
Right.
Otherwise, there are a lot of people who are worried about, I don't want anybody to know my health,
Well, and that is another subject I think that we'll cover in more detail when we get to the second segment on the ethics.
Well, and I know also when they first started doing DNA, and I know periodically it comes up with people are afraid of doing a DNA test because they're afraid that they may get arrested for something, and that's not a part of what the DNA that we use as genealogists is actually doing.
Well, maybe this is a good segue into a recent announcement by the Board for Certification of Genealogists. The board on October 28th of this year adopted DNA standards. And we adopted those standards because it was felt that there was a real need for this, not only because we have this exponential growth in the number of testers, but there was a concern that people are either not understanding when DNA evidence could be relevant, or they're using it and not using it properly. And the Board for Certification published genealogy standards back in 2000. And it is a kind of guide to best practices in genealogy. And the genealogy standards, as you know, is not just for board certified genealogists, it's also made available to the genealogical community at large. And so it was felt that this need for standards when it comes to genetic genealogists is something in keeping with the board's mission to promote excellence, to promote competency and uniform standards. I think it's fair to say, it has been said, that this is probably the most significant work the board has done since genealogy standards were first published. We expect that a second edition incorporating genetic-specific standards will be published by next March. And in the interim, because of contractual obligations with the publisher of genealogy standards, we're not able to just put them up on the website. But BCG associates are free to talk about these things. And so I think it's timely to do that. The other thing I want to point out is that there was a genetic genealogy committee organized by BCG, and it was not limited to board certified genealogists. Blaine Bettinger, who is one of the leading genetic genealogists, was involved in developing these new standards, and he's said that in a blog on his web post, so that's not a secret. And after the board reviewed the initial draft of new standards, they were put out for public comment over a 2-month period, so that anyone in the genealogical community could comment, and many people did. And so I thought that that was important for people to understand, that this isn't something that BCG has just put out there, that it consulted with people inside and outside of BCG to come up with guidance that everyone can use in using this new type of evidence.
Well, and I think it's important for people to understand it. You know, the standards that are out there, even if you're not going for certification or are certified, you know, it's helpful to try to meet them, because then you run into fewer of the problems of, you know, things that are out there, and, you know, genealogy, family trees that show up that are incorrect. You know, my distant cousin has my grandmother with 5 children that my grandmother never gave birth to, because she wasn't evaluating things. So these standards are helpful to anybody.
Well, yes, they ensure a better outcome.
Yeah, it really gives you a chance to do a better quality of research, and the end product hopefully is something that you've written, reliable, and published or have out there in some manner.
The same thing that is true of the general genealogy standards is true of genetic genealogy standards. That I think Harold Henderson has made this point and says it best, that a highly competent genealogist probably wouldn't need genealogy standards, but why have every genealogist recreate the will every time they come across a project? These are guidelines, not hard and fast rules, and that same thing is true of these new standards, which again reflect best practices among leading genealogists, so that people are applying a uniform standard and not recreating the will every time they come across an issue involving DNA. I also wanted to mention that some folks may be interested in knowing what the difference is between what was just released and what was released back in January of 2015. There was an ad hoc committee of genealogists, and they released the genetic genealogy standards. And the fact, well, I'll point out a couple of things. That 2015 ad hoc committee was not affiliated with any particular organization, but many of the people involved in that release were also involved in developing the BCG standards. Blaine Bettinger was one of them, and there were several or few board certified genealogists, some of whom were also involved in the current effort, who put together that piece. The other and the main difference is that that standard focused mainly on ethical obligations, ethical issues. And actually the stated purpose of that 2015 release was for use when purchasing, recommending, sharing, or writing about the results of DNA ancestry. And there was some thought at the time, reflected in blog posts, that they were going to go back and provide more practical advice about the use of genetic genealogy, but that never happened. I believe that these new BCG standards, or the additions to genealogy standards, because again, they're not just BCG standards, fill that void in providing more practical guidance on how you use this evidence.
Could you characterize the changes, the additions, as just being really adding in the dimension of DNA into the existing standards and expanding on that a little bit?
Well, and it might be helpful to give a couple of examples of what some of the standards are, too.
Well, absolutely. And, the press release that asks for comments on the draft standards pointed out that this issue had been a matter of rather intense debate, because there are folk of the view that we didn't need DNA-specific standards, because we have the genealogical proof standard, and all the other standards flow from that. And again, I point to those who say that, yes, highly competent people might figure this out, but a lot of people are misinterpreting the rules, and it makes sense to look at what established genetic genealogists are doing and provide that kind of best practice guidance for everyone. So what you'll see in the new standards are, the genealogy standards did refer to DNA as evidence that you should take into account, but there wasn't enough specifics. And we have to acknowledge that DNA evidence is not always available, it's not always relevant, and it's not always usable to solve a specific problem. So what the new standards will do, they'll update 4 existing standards to make things clear. For example, there is a specific standard now that talks about citations and making sure that you establish the record underlying or the proof underlying specific standards. And when you're dealing with a DNA project, it's important to establish generational links, the basis for that, just making that clear. So that's one of the specific changes that was made. The current edition of genealogy standards has 6 chapters. There will be a new 7th chapter titled Standards for Using Genetic Evidence. And that chapter will set forth standards for properly interpreting, analyzing, and correlating DNA evidence. One of the errors that leading genealogists have seen others make is the failure to consider or take into account the possibility of multiple ancestors in a line. People would look to see how much autosomal DNA was shared, compare family trees, and if they found the same name in a family tree, assume that they must have inherited that shared DNA from that same ancestor, without taking into account all of the factors that could affect that conclusion, including that they were sharing multiple ancestors. Or that there could be errors in someone's tree, as Chuck just pointed out, with the cousin adding, counting 5 children for a grandmother who never had 5 children. Yeah. And so this new standard specifically talks about effective planning DNA tests by knowing when what kind of test is available, from which company. And always, just as in the case of general genealogical issues, starting with a research question. If a research question is who are the common ancestors, grandparents or great-grandparents of a research subject, you would look for tests and then test takers that have the potential to answer or address that question. And that's consistent with the standards that we all would have applied anyway.
Right.
But people aren't doing that.
Well, and I think, there are those who are just in this for the hobby, and they really don't dig into how they actually should be doing genealogical research. One of the common comments that I have from students that come to my beginning classes, I've been doing this for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and now I've decided that I really need to learn how to do it correctly. And in some cases, they have to really go back and reevaluate and relook at some of the things that they did way back when.
Well, and if you're trying to answer a question where you don't have any indirect documentary evidence, and now you want to use DNA, that's where these standards are really important, because you're going to base your conclusion on something that you have no documentary evidence for.
Well, and I focus on African American families that came out of slavery. So that is a population where there isn't a lot of direct evidence. Much of the evidence is indirect, and so DNA can be very important. That is not the only community where that's true, but DNA evidence can corroborate the proof that you might be able to assemble based on the indirect evidence that does exist. And let me just say to the point you made, Chuck, about folk who are doing this as a hobby. I was one of those people who, for literally decades, after Roots, happily spending extra time researching and getting lots of things wrong, making all of the mistakes, even with my legal training, making all of the mistakes that people make who don't take the time to educate themselves about methodology. And certainly for people who are either helping paying clients or helping other family members, even if you don't plan to specialize in this or become an expert, you need to know enough to know when DNA evidence could be helpful, and you need to know enough to know which company you should test with, and something about, even if you end up referring someone to someone who does have expertise, you need to know that minimum amount of information.
Yeah. I think Alex Haley got a lot of us into genealogy.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
That was certainly something I always had an interest, but I think, seeing Roots helped too, although I still didn't jump into it.
I think the thing
right
that
there,
Roots did was to just tell ordinary folks of whatever persuasion that you too can find out more about your family and your family history. That was the revolutionary thought, that it's not just what people used to refer to as blue bloods.
Yeah,
we all have a history.
Exactly.
And I believe that every family history is interesting. There's no...
It's not only interesting, but a lot of our family history that's been passed down, isn't always exactly true. I guess
that's
I hate to say that,
case.
but and so
the other thing that I should mention is that there are additions to the glossary of terms that at the end of genealogy standards, so that we're all on the same page and using the same term. I think Blaine Bettinger coined the term tree completeness. So there's a definition of completeness, what that means. And it refers to how thorough the pedigree is. And it refers to the depth of your pedigree. And in fact, there's a definition of depth, and that refers to the number of generations that you've taken into account or that should be taken into account as you analyze the results of DNA tests. And typically that includes all generations, at least back to the hypothesized common ancestor or ancestral couple. So that is another thing that you can expect to see in the second edition of genealogy standards, this glossary that now includes DNA-specific terms so that we're all talking the same language as genealogists.
And the autosomal really only can go back a certain number.
Yeah, I was really disappointed the first time I went to a seminar or heard a webinar and heard someone say that after second cousins, it starts getting iffy. And some people say after the fourth cousin,
Yeah, 7.
there is, I know at least one
generations.
published or peer-reviewed article where someone went back to fifth or sixth cousins, but that is true. It doesn't go back as far. But where you have that evidence, you should try to use it in conjunction with those other specific tests that some people focus on alone, the Y-DNA
Right.
for the patrilineal line and mitochondrial DNA.
Because those go a lot further.
They
Those
go
will
a lot farther, especially the
infinite.
mitochondrial.
Yeah.
I mean, they can rule out things if you have totally different haplogroups, but mitochondrial DNA could mean that you descended from a common ancestor who lived thousands and thousands of years ago.
That's exciting.
Well, and our time is just about up. How quickly it has gone. LaBrenda, we definitely want to thank you for coming in and joining us. I think
Been
this
very
is
interesting.
a very interesting topic to both Janelle and I and the viewers. So.
And I just want to put a plug in for the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. We're here in Alexandria, Virginia on 1500 Shenandoah Road. We hope you will join us. Once a month we have some of the best speakers in the industry, and you're certainly welcome to join us. Go to our website to find out more information. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, LaBrenda.